Today we're going to talk about the remaining elitist dictatorships throughout Latin America. And one thing that we're going to note pretty clearly, not just based off of this list, but in general, the remaining dictatorships in the early 1900s, or by the mid 1900s, will mostly be based in countries that have fairly small populations because they have not industrialized. Is still unindustrial. It's still basically farming peasants and artisans. So the Cadillo era often extends much further into those countries' timelines than other countries that are at least starting to undergo industrialization by the early 1900s. And that landowner power often allows them to stay in government power and to make deals with often military leaders to set up dictatorships that are very difficult to overthrow until you get industrialization, which leads to industrial worker unions and movements to establish some type of democracy. The big exception to that we're talking about today is really Venezuela, because they do start undergoing industrialization and they get involved in the worldwide industrial economy once they start developing their oil reserves in the early 1900s. And their dictatorships really only stay in office through the use of mass violence and mass repression against the population. So we'll talk about the three smaller population states, El Salvador, Ecuador, and Bolivia, that remain mostly unindustrialized until the mid 1900s. And then we'll get to the exception, that's Venezuela. So starting with El Salvador, since the 1800s, was mostly run by the big landowning families. So by around the late 1800s, they become known as Las Catorce, which means the 14 major landowning families in the whole country basically dominate the government, they dominate the politics. They are the economic elite. They are the richest of the big landowning families. And they've dominated Salvadoran politics since the late 1800s at least, and going far into the 1900s, all the way up to about 1930, 1931. The Melendez family is probably the most famous and the most powerful by the early 1900s. They have several members of their family become president, and probably the most famous of them is Carlos Melendez, who was president in two different terms in the 19 teens. The El Salvadorian economy was growing fairly quickly since the late 1800s, mostly because of their national cash crop, which was coffee. So the Guatemalan economy largely produces coffee beans and then sells them on the world market, and that is what enriches the landowners for generations. The general workforce, the farming peasants, largely hated the landowning lands, the big landowning families, for obvious reasons, because they feel economically exploited and politically repressed. And they launch a series of different attempts at revolt against their government from 1870 until the early 1900s. And they all fail to overthrow the government and gain popular rights and whatnot. Those groups, the peasant farmers who are angry at the government, largely become known as the campesinos. And they argue for greater, what we would today call human rights, political rights. So the landowning families basically run the country through 1930, when in May 1930 large crowds start to gather at the capital city in San Salvador to demand better wages and better working conditions. One of the landowners speaks to the complaints of the workers to at least a decent extent, and he runs in the presidential election 1931 with his platform being basically to give in to the demonstrator demands and get as much support from them as possible. He won the 1931 presidential election, and immediately afterward, after he's installed as president, announced that the Communist Party and other political parties would be allowed to run in city-based elections, citywide elections in 1932. and the military didn't like that at all, so they overthrew him in 1932, 31, 32. Basically kicked him out of office and installed the sitting vice president at the time, general in the army, Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, as the acting president. And so he'll serve out the rest of the presidential term through 1934. In the middle of his term, there's actually a natural disaster in El Salvador. There's a couple of volcanoes that erupted in January 1932, which pushed a lot of the natives out of the highlands, out of the mountains, and down into the towns that are down in the valleys below. And they're so angry at this military coup that had kicked out a lot of the president and other politicians that were very favorable to their complaints. And combined with their just desperation due to the natural disaster, they go into the towns and they make demands of the major landowners in the area. And when the landowners largely reject their demands, they attack and they kill many of the landowning families. Another kind of separate revolt gets started in other areas, which largely is a communist revolt, but kind of feeds into the native uprisings that are started around the same time. So there's this giant wave of different revolts that are kind of flowing around the country in 1932, early 32. And President Martinez's policy was basically to bring out the military and start massacring anyone who was standing up against the government. This largely turns into a race war that Martinez allowed the army to kill basically any native, any indigenous person that they could possibly find or presented any threat to them at all, which eventually killed up to about 20,000 Salvadorans in these mass protests, which is somewhere around 1% of the population at the time. So this is a massive wave of violence in the country, perpetuated at the highest level of the government, and protected by the sitting president, and really enforced by his control over the army. So the 1932 mass protest and the government repression, destruction of those protest movements have big major results for El Salvador's kind of long-term development. Number one, the peasant farmers will never really trust the city-based leaders ever again, even when a lot of the city-based leaders declare themselves revolutionaries against the government, who want to support democracy and freedom and human rights and all those types of things. A lot of the peasants will even distrust those leaders who say that they're on the side of the peasants. So there's a long-standing kind of belief amongst the peasants that these mass protests in 32 and the government violence against them basically taught the peasant farmers to never trust anyone from the cities again. Another major result is that indigenous people in El Salvador, natives, would largely start to abandon their heritage and their image and their language and start to mix much more with the Europeanized population in order to just basically survive, to avoid any other type of kind of ethnic massacre led by the government to eradicate the native population. So a lot of individual natives figure that the best way for them personally to survive is to basically present themselves in more European ways and leave behind their native heritage in order to not be attacked in case that genocidal government policy comes into force again. Another major result is that leftist politicians and some people, the just general population, especially in the cities throughout the country, they continue to grow their movements. So there's a continuing kind of underground growth of communist beliefs, socialist beliefs, and other, again, leftist movements. And the people in power, largely the conservatives, the forces on the right side of the political spectrum, largely, the big landowning families and the economic elites, they will continue to rely on just outright military repression of the mass population in order to stay in power. So Martinez largely remains in power. There's a break in his term, but he comes back in 1935. And he stays in power largely until 1944. And a series of other military generals largely follow him after 44 and really retain control over the country mostly into the 1980s. There is a civilian movement that overthrew one of the military dictatorships in 1960, but the military launched a counter coup in 1961, and that put the military back in power. So the military basically runs the Salvadoran government really from the early 1930s through at least 1985 when they announced the first free presidential elections. So that's El Salvador's kind of very slow and sad democratic development through most of the 1900s. So now we'll go on to Ecuador. Ecuador's Caudillo era largely lasts up into the early 1900s, and it largely, interestingly, combines with a liberal movement to create a dictatorship that will last until 1925, and we'll talk about what that dictatorship kind of does that kind of gets it a liberal label. But even after 1925, there is a kind of middle-class based government for a few years. But once the Great Depression starts in Ecuador in 1930, that causes such instability at any kind of popular democracy largely collapses within just a few years. So in the late 1800s, Ecuador's economy was mostly based on cacao. And that brought great wealth to the big landowners who dedicated their lands to growing cacao and selling it on the international market. So just like we saw in El Salvador, the landowners are the wealthiest class in society, and they tend to politically dominate the government. Combination of their wealth, Caudillo wealth basically, will combine with a liberal party that is able to kind of make deals with the caudillos in order to build up a government that they'll run as a dictatorship. But because some of them are politically liberal, they actually do some fairly progressive things for Ecuadorian society. The biggest is in their relations with the Catholic Church. Most liberals in the 1800s argued that the church is okay to have in society, but it should be separated from the government, and the church should basically run itself as a private enterprise without a whole lot of government intervention or control, or even church and government cooperation in big parts of the economy. And the conservatives of the 1800s, they wanted to keep the church as a kind of quasi-government entity. So that was often the big difference between liberals and conservatives throughout much of Latin America in the 1800s. So in the early 1900s, this dictatorship in Ecuador pursued fairly liberal policies related to the church. It separated Catholicism, the church, from the government almost completely, and from there, the government started passing laws that legalized divorce, created what we call civil marriage, which means that individuals could go through the civil court system and get married through that without going through the church system at all. So those are pretty liberal, pretty progressive kind of religious policies for a government to have at the time. It also kind of separated the Catholic Church from the government education systems and welfare systems. So before this, the Catholic Church in Ecuador largely functioned the way we often saw kind of European medieval church function in the Middle Ages. The church basically ran the education system in the society, and ran what we would today call the social welfare system. If poor people need help, they often didn't go to the government, they went to the church, and tried to get jobs or asked for money or some kind of like church-based housing just so that they could survive. So the church had a very heavy influence in the society because it was running a lot of the kind of poor relief and the schools, and they were all, very religious-based schools. Um, so Europe started to end that as it emerged from the Middle Ages, and Ecuador as a government will start to end that connection in the early 1900s. So the state will take over public education. So the government runs public education, builds schools that are not tied to religion much at all. So it's secular education that is funded through just government tax revenue. And same with social welfare systems. The government takes those over. The church might be allowed to run its own as a private entity if it chooses, but most people will go into the state welfare system, poor relief or workhouses or something, whatever the government is building to try to alleviate poverty in the country. So that's generally why it's called the so-called liberal dictatorship, because liberalism and dictatorship don't usually go together very well. But in this case, it was a dictatorship that liberal politicians ran to stay in power so that they could make these changes in Ecuadorian society. The liberal dictatorship also wanted to build public infrastructure, what we often call public works, like education systems, welfare systems, roads, hospitals, schools, those general types of things. But most of the government was really financed through tariffs, taxes on imports. And Ecuador just was not importing and therefore not taxing enough stuff in order to get the revenue that could afford to build that public infrastructure. So they largely turned to borrowing from international bankers or whatever international lenders they could find to finance their infrastructure projects. And this became largely a national disaster when Ecuador's cacao market started to decline in the 1920s due to diseases in the plants on the land, and also just a lot of other, especially Latin American countries, get into the cacao market because it's so profitable. So there's a kind of natural disaster in Ecuador amongst their own plants in the 1920s, at the same time as other countries start dedicating their lands to cacao growing, and therefore some price warfare gets going in that decade also. This liberal dictatorship in Caudillo era largely ends in 1925 when a group of younger military officers basically overthrow the government. So they form a group that they call the League of Young Officers. And the young officers are really important because the older officers who had the highest levels, the kind of general levels in the military, were often just inheritors from wealthy landowning families who hadn't really been in the military as a career. They were just made generals just out of like honorary titles, basically. So they didn't have the real support of the soldiers. It was the younger officers, the sergeants, lieutenants, captains, colonels, and whatnot, who had joined the military from a young age and kind of worked their way up through the ranks. So they're the ones that had the support of the general soldiers, and they're the ones who kind of overthrew the government in 1925. And they put a new president in office, Isidro Ayora, and they make him president of the country. So his term starts in 1926. And he talked about how he would run the country for the national good rather than his own personal empowerment and enrichment, which was basically a statement that the previous presidents and the previous dictators in government, they basically ran the country for their own benefit. And he basically says, I'm not going to do that, so it'll be a much better government. So Ayora does do very kind of important things to develop the power of the central Ecuadorian government. He created a central bank to run money lending and also run tax collection and basically be the government treasury. He restructured the government budget to try to save money, reduce embezzlement and waste and fraud, restructured the tax system to again make it more efficient, and especially restructured the tariff system, the taxes on imports and tax collection on imports. So all these reforms brought a lot of new revenue to the Ecuadorian government, while also increasing taxes on the economic elites, the landowners. So he's getting more tax revenue from the big source, the people who have the money, which tended to reduce the elite families' dominance over the economy. If they have to pay more taxes, they don't have nearly as many resources any longer to keep their monopolistic control over the economy. And also, he passed a new constitution in 1929 that gave voting rights to women, which was the very first in any Latin American country to do so, and gave more power to the legislature to make laws and pass laws without being dominated by the presidency. The problem, though, is that the Great Depression really devastated the Ecuadorian economy, largely because the Ecuadorian economy was, number one, reliant on exports like cacao, which is the main ingredient in chocolate. And economists call that a luxury good. People don't need to eat or drink chocolate in order to survive. So it's a luxury. It's something that you enjoy, but it's not a necessity. So usually in giant economic turmoil, when just general working people are afraid of going bankrupt or paying their bills or just buying enough food to eat, they generally cut back on their luxury spending. So they stop buying chocolate and they start putting all their money in just having the basic enough food on a daily basis to survive. So that did a lot of harm to Ecuador's economy because it was so heavily reliant on things like cacao. And also their international borrowing over the previous few years had caused major problems because now bankers are desperate to get any revenue they can, so they start calling in loans. So all this instability really took down Ayora's government by 1931, and several different presidencies come and go very, very fast. Basically, different politicians made big promises to end the destruction of the Depression and figure out a solution, and nothing they did really seemed to work. So you have several different politicians kind of come and go in office very quickly, to the point we just don't have enough time to analyze them individually. Though probably the most famous and most important one was Jose Maria Velasco Ibarra. He rose to power based on being the president of the Chamber of Deputies, which was really the kind of Congress of the country at the time. And when he got into power, he actually closed Congress in order to just run the country based on the laws it already had. And a lot of people complained about that, so he started jailing his opponents and people who criticized him and started building up a dictatorship. So that proved so unpopular when he started it in 1934 that the military kicked him out of office by 1935 and sent him into exile. So he goes away for quite a while, which starts the revolving door again of other presidents and other politicians. So one after another in the 1930s and early 1940s. And one of those presidents pushed Ecuador into a war against Peru, one of its neighbors, over some areas in the Amazon River basin. That war started in 1941. And Ecuador lost that war so badly and had to give land to Peru that politician became hugely unpopular, obviously, because the war was a disaster. And Velasco Ibarra actually came back at that point, started a new political party, basically centered on just popular anger against the government for having started that disastrous war in the first place, and eventually forced that president to resign in 1944, and Velasco Ibarra came back into power at that point. and he promised to basically end corruption and stop the economic elites from basically running the government, because they had run the government into this war that was such a disaster. So he promised a lot of things, social justice for the poor and to end corruption and all these things, but he did very little to actually achieve much of anything. And in his second term in office, starting in 44, inflation starts to rise in the economy, so the government has problems gaining enough revenue to pay its bills. And by 1947, the military's had it with him again. They kick him out of office again. And from that point forward, again, different politicians, both on the liberal side and the conservative side, fight over who's going to replace Ibarra, until some liberal leaders put together enough of a coalition to basically gain the military support and stay in power for a while. But that takes us up into Ecuador's history into the late 1940s. But again, outside of the more popular presidency of Isidro Ayora for 5 years, Ecuador is still a dictatorship and will be into the 1950s. So that sends us on to the next country, which is Bolivia. And Bolivia will see its Caudillo era end in 1883, largely because of this completely disastrous War of the Pacific, where Bolivia joined with Peru and tried to take on Chile, but Chile won the war, and therefore it took a lot of land from Bolivia and Peru. And some of the most important land in Bolivia, which was its access to the coastline, which gave it its economy, a city, a port basically, to export and import goods. So Bolivia lost control over that land after the war, and that was such a giant national disaster that seems to have ended the Caudillo era completely. And more liberal politicians will take control of the country, but one after another, they will resort to dictatorship in order to stay in control and continue running the country. So they may do some things, some progressive ideas every once in a while, but it's still dictatorship that runs the country straight through to 1952. So dictatorship will really dominate the whole era. So in the late 1800s, after the War of the Pacific, Bolivia's history, Bolivia's government, its big initiative is to try to build up transportation networks, basically roads, some railroads, but not many, to unite the country together, to unite at least the big cities together so that the economy could grow through just trade amongst the cities at least. But again, their long-term economic problem is that they don't have a port and access to the coastline anymore. Liberal politicians and conservative politicians really go back and forth in the late 1800s in controlling the Bolivian dictatorship. And usually when conservatives are in office, they tend to run land confiscations against their native populations. So the government increasingly takes over more and more native land and often puts it up for auction. So native groups are losing lots of land in the late 1800s, and that inspires a major native rebellion in 1899 that is largely led by Pablo Zarate Wilca. Once the native revolt gets going in 1899, the conservatives are in power at that point, and the Liberal Party largely supported the native rebellion because it knew that that rebellion was humiliating and damaging to the Conservative Party. So the liberal politicians are on the side of the rebellion, perhaps not so much because they really support what the natives want or what the rebellion is about, but they use it as a tool to try to hurt the Conservative Party. And you often see that in party politics in many countries throughout the world, that the kind of minority or opposition party makes choices that might not even be in the national interest in order to just hurt their internal political opponents. So the rebellion itself is all in 1899 until the government rises up and really destroys it. But Vilca's forces defeat several conservative armies, and the Conservative Party basically sent out the Bolivian army to take on the rebels. And the native rebels actually win several battles against the army, um, and their rebellion continues to grow pretty much unabated for several months. Then the liberals kind of continue to cheer it on because, again, it was so humiliating to the Conservative Party. But then the natives also turn on the Liberal Party and massacre a bunch of uh, military officers and soldiers that had identified as part of the Liberal Party. So that tends to outrage the liberal leaders, and so the liberals start to kind of fall in line with the conservatives that this rebellion has to be defeated. And when Wilca's forces then openly proclaimed an entire race war against all Europeans in Bolivia, that basically Bolivia should be run by the native Bolivians, and that all the Europeans should be either kicked out of the country or wiped out, that really convinces the liberals to side with the conservatives just in order to survive. And their combined forces really defeat the native rebellion by the end of 1899. And the conservatives, again, were so humiliated that the liberals were able to take power over the government in 1900, and they make big promises to the natives that they're going to end all these land confiscations. But the liberals are largely in power for about 20 years, and they almost completely fail to do so. So the confiscations continue. And that obviously outrages the natives generation after generation. 20 years of failed promises is quite a long time. So in the end, the natives don't trust the conservatives at all, and they largely have given up on any liberal promises that have been made to them. So most natives, even those that have lost their land, they often still work on the same land. They just work for some Europeanized Bolivian landowner. So they still work on farms, but they're largely wage workers now instead of working on land that their indigenous tribes owned and controlled. So by the 1920s, natives only control about 1/3 of even the mountainous areas that have some of the worst farmland. So they will start a series of rebellions. Probably the biggest of those rebellions is in 1927 at Chayanta. And this uprising spread to somewhere around 10,000 natives in 9 different provinces across all of Bolivia. So it is a major kind of national uprising amongst indigenous people. And again, the government sends out its army and has to use mass violence to destroy and suppress these native voices for the long term. So it's a very kind of violent 30 years or so, 40 years from the 1880s through the 1920s, largely between the Bolivian government and its indigenous people. So there's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of violence, and a lot of distrust generationally from one generation to another in Bolivia. And another conflict that got going almost immediately after that for Bolivia is when oil companies start poking around in southeastern Bolivia in this area called the Chaco region, right on the border with Paraguay. And they report that there seems to be a whole lot of oil underneath that ground, which convinced both Paraguay and Bolivia to try to lay claim to those border regions as much as they possibly can. And the Bolivian president at the time ordered Bolivian troops to go into not just up to the border, but to actually occupy a fort that Paraguay claimed as its own in 1932. And that occupation of that fort convinced the Paraguayan government to declare war, and that starts what becomes known as the Chaco War of 1932 that will be fought for several years till 35. And we have to remember that the Great Depression has already started by now, and Bolivia is already a poor country. So the Great Depression, starting around 1930-31 in Bolivia, does great damage to its economy. And many Bolivians feel that this war is really just a distraction to, get the mass amount of the Bolivian population on the government side through like patriotic calls to go to war and defend the country and all that, in order to distract them from the economic damage that the government didn't seem able to solve. So the Bolivian soldiers try to go in and occupy the Chaco region. They go in really in a conventional military style. They go in and they try to control land, and they try to fight major pitched battles on battlefields against the Paraguayan army, largely because the Bolivian army thought it had an advantage in that kind of warfare. And the Paraguayan military largely seemed to agree, because they avoid those battles and they instead train their soldiers in guerrilla tactics, which means really hit and run type tactics where you hide in the mountains or wherever you can, and where you see a good opportunity, you launch a quick attack against the enemy, and once that attack is over, very quickly you run back and hide wherever you can again before your enemy's major army can come to the area and launch a counterattack against you. So the Paraguayan soldiers are fighting largely what we call guerrilla warfare tactic, these hit and run type tactics. And they're largely successful in stopping the Bolivian army from taking over more land, and does a lot of damage to the Bolivian military. So about 65,000 Bolivians die in this war. That's just on the Bolivian side. So it's a very costly war and a very kind of emotional war for the Bolivian population. The death rate is so high. But historians today estimate that most of those deaths were largely from disease like malaria. They were going into a different type of climate, and malaria just ravaged their soldiers. So in the end, though, Bolivia lost the war and largely lost control over the Chaco region. So Paraguay really celebrates that in 1935. And then over the next few years, it's largely revealed that the area doesn't contain nearly as much oil as the companies had originally thought, and that the oil that exists in the area is actually in the land that Bolivia retained after the peace treaty was signed. So it ends up being a fairly kind of useless and pointless war on both sides. But the war does have big results for development of Bolivian society and government. A lot of natives were drafted into the Bolivian army, which kind of integrated them more into general Bolivian society and Bolivian population. So the younger native men are no longer like fully isolated from the towns and cities and the more Europeanized Bolivians, because once they're drafted into the army, they have to basically, serve and live with and get to know the Europeanized Bolivians much better. The military catastrophe also completely humiliated the normal political parties in Bolivia, and started a popular call for major changes to politics and the government. And the military leaders basically overthrew the government in 1936 and installed one of their own to be the new president. And that new president will have a new constitution written that gives the government more power to intervene in the economy, and largely uses that power to nationalize the Standard Oil company infrastructure in Bolivia. So the Standard Oil resources become owned by the Bolivian government. The problem with the new constitution, though, is that it kept the literacy test that had largely restricted voting to only the highly educated Bolivians, which are basically the economic elite. So in order to be allowed to vote in elections, you had to pass a literacy test, and a lot of the poor Bolivian farmers just didn't have the time or the resources locally to learn to read and write, so they didn't. and therefore they couldn't pass the literacy test and they could not vote. So in the whole country, there's only about 50,000 voters, even in the 1930s. And almost all of them were from the kind of elite class, the wealthy, or some middle class people who had somehow gotten access to education. And by the late 1930s, there's the growth of new political parties in response to this disastrous war, and also the new military government's demands. So there's several left-wing and liberal parties that get going in the late 1930s, and they basically demand more nationalization of foreign companies in Bolivia. And the biggest part of the Bolivian economy by this point, and largely had been historically, are the mines. Copper, gold, silver, and tin mines. So mining was one of the big jobs in Bolivia, and in the late 30s and early 40s, in different areas and working for different companies, a lot of these workers start pushing for unions. So they start unionizing. And as their union movements grow and become more powerful, those union leaders start to realize that they need to get involved in politics in order to protect their unions, in order to make sure that politicians do not get into office that will look to pass laws to get rid of unionization completely. So quickly after these workers unionize, they start becoming a political force, and they start forming alliances with these new kind of leftist political parties in the late 30s and 40s. And a series of strikes start to hit, especially in the early 1940s, while World War II is going, and demand for copper, tin, those types of things are at an all-time high, because all the countries fighting World War II need those resources to build the military hardware, the planes, tanks, and bombs and whatnot to win the war. So the unions, the mining unions in Bolivia, see a great opportunity. The companies are making huge profits because demand is surging for those mining products, those resources. So when the unions go on strike, they demand very large increases in wages and better working conditions and whatnot. The combination of liberal and left-wing politicians and the new miners' unions, as they demand nationalization of increasing amounts of the Bolivian mineral economy, they start launching a series of major strikes, and the biggest one happens at Katavi in 1947. And this picture is of modern-day Katavi, so you see it's very largely dug out. A lot of mining companies had built kind of housing for their workers, and that's largely what you see a picture of here. So the housing wasn't great because the companies wanted to save money, and the miners were angry at those kind of living and working conditions, and so they led a massive strike in the whole region in 1947. The companies and the governments were so afraid of that the companies argued that the government should send in troops and just destroy the strike, and that's exactly what the government did in 1947, sent in the Bolivian army to attack its own people to force them back to work. And so a lot of these miners are massacred at Katafi in 1947, and that just stokes even more popular rage against the government. And that popular rage in the late 1940s leads to the creation of a whole new kind of general movement, not just amongst the mining unions, but becomes a mass political party that many, many Bolivians that aren't even miners themselves join because they're so angry at the government just by default. So this becomes known as the MNR, the Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario, which basically means the National Revolutionary Movement. So they will take many steps in the late 1940s and early 50s, increasingly aggressive against the government to try to demand the end of these dictatorships and this cooperation with these companies that are so hated throughout Bolivia. and they want more democracy because they figure if they're, mass majority of society, they'll win any elections, any popular elections that are allowed. So their first big step as a general movement is an actual armed revolt against the army in 1949, which doesn't go all that well because general population, they're not militarily trained and don't have access to powerful weaponry, aren't largely likely to overthrow their own army, which does have more funding and better weapons. But they attempt it, and that attempt all by itself gives more confidence for them to take the next step, which is a giant strike in the capital city of La Paz in 1950. So a general strike of nearly all workers in the entire city that brings the city's economy down to a screeching halt. And the sitting government at the time had to send in not just the military, but with artillery, which means rocket launchers and weapons that would usually be used to bombard an enemy army when you launch an invasion. So airplanes dropping bombs on the general population in order to crush this strike and force the people back to work. So that's the only way that the government can retain any control, is just through massive amounts of violence. And then there's a 1951 presidential election that MNR ran its own candidates and won 53% of the presidential vote, so they had a majority, and they expected their presidential candidate to go in office, and they also were set to take control over the legislature. But the army said that communists must have been involved in this in order to get enough of that vote. And so the army just voided the results, said it was an illegitimate election, and the army just tried to keep power. And that outraged the population so much that the MNR told the people to go out and seize weapons from government installations, from what in the United States we basically call National Guard armories. So you have these kind of set kind of weapons depots all throughout the country. And a lot of these depots are not very heavily guarded. So MNR told the people to go get big weapons from those armories and basically rise up as an entire population and overthrow the government. And that's what the people do. They go and seize weapons that the government owns, and again they take on the National Army, this time much better armed in 1952, and they actually defeated the National Army. A lot of soldiers broke ranks and joined the revolution that becomes known as the Revolution of 1952. And MNR basically overthrew the government and called for new elections in 1952, popular elections that would elect a democratic government. And this revolution in 1952 is a big change in Latin American history. It's the first revolution of the people, a popular revolution in Latin America, to succeed in forming a new government since the Mexican Revolution of 1910. So other revolts had been attempted, but at some point the government came back and was able to retain power. But in Bolivia in 1952, this is a big sea change. And there's a lot of feeling of great optimism, not just for Bolivia, but that this idea could be spread to the rest of Latin America to overthrow many of these dictatorships. So that'll have a big effect as we get into talking about Latin America and the general Cold War. Because countries like the United States will be very worried that these types of revolutions are led by communists to overthrow governments and establish communism in Latin America to try to help the Soviet Union basically take over the world. So we'll get into that more later. But the next country we need to talk about in the earlier 1900s is Venezuela. So Venezuela is the great exception to all of this that we're talking about today. Most of the countries we talked about have very small populations. They're therefore unindustrialized even by the mid-1900s. So they largely didn't have the big industrial unions and whatnot that could form the types of popular democratic movements that could overthrow dictatorships, as we saw in Bolivia. And again, Venezuela is the big exception. They already have a large population in the early 1900s and started going active industrialization in the early 1900s, but basically the military governments are able to keep control one way or the other throughout this whole period, really getting close to 1950. So the dictator that we've talked about before, the military dictator Castro, in the very early 1900s was overthrown when his personal corruption became so public at such an extent that even the military couldn't put up with this guy anymore. So they kicked him out in 1908, and the presidency then fell to another guy named Juan Vicente Gomez, who generally ran Venezuela pretty well economically. So this is where industrialization will take off, and his government's very good at encouraging industrialization, especially in certain sectors of the economy. And he'll stay in power for good, almost 30 years. But he stays in power through just brutal repression of the population. So he was a fairly paranoid government leader. He created spy networks where government investigators would read people's mail before it was delivered to them, because governments run post offices, obviously, and before electronic communication, writing letters to other people was the big way to communicate with people not in your own household, and that had to go through the post office. So the government had its list of people it wanted to investigate, just intercepted their mail that was addressed to them, opened it and read it, and tried to learn what they're talking about with their friends. So he said, and these spy networks also extended to the general population. If you were hanging out in a coffee house or a bar or just public park or anything, any place where people just gathered to relax and talk about shoot the breeze, whatever, you could never be sure if someone sitting a table or two down from you or just walking by might be a government spy. Just milling around, listening to what people are talking about. And if your conversation kind of verges into any criticism of the government, they might write your name down. And then you'll get a visit, sometimes in the middle of the night, to take you away and question you. So Gomez set up these spy networks in order to listen to what the general population is talking about and also terrorize his political enemies. Anyone that might be talking about forming a union that he doesn't like or forming a new political party to oppose his government. So there's a lot of kind of mass arrests based on little evidence. There's torture. There's executions and exile. So Gomez is running a pretty brutal dictatorship. And that's largely how he stays in power. The big thing for his era, especially getting to the 1920s, is that he pushes Venezuela to continue developing its oil-based economy. Venezuela has one of the larger oil reserves even in the world today. And in the early 1900s, most people did not know about, even oil companies did not know about the vast oil reserves in what we today call the Middle East. So if you're in the oil business in the early 1900s, the big places that you're looking to get oil from are largely in Latin America, places like Ecuador, Venezuela, and the United States. The United States has big oil reserves also. So Gomez will lead Venezuela into developing its areas that companies are discovering oil in as they're kind of poking around in different areas. And he largely did this by selling what become known as concessions to oil companies, basically contracts to oil companies, that a company would pay the government a very large fee for the contract to explore, mine, which means pull out, extract the oil, remove it from the ground, even refine the oil and sell it on international markets. So companies would buy those contracts, those permissions to explore and extract oil in certain geographic areas of the country and in certain times. So you can buy, 2-year contract or something like that. So the Venezuelan government loved this system because it brought massive profits. I mean, oil companies were willing to pay huge amounts of money to get rights to go into certain areas of Venezuela to mine for oil. So government was making huge windfall profits off of this. And the government didn't really have to do much about it. Basically just wrote it up on a piece of paper for a huge amount of money and gave it to the company. And the company was responsible for running all that stuff itself, for building its own infrastructure, for kind of responsibility for overseeing how that stuff is run. So the government really gets money for almost nothing outside of just allowing their country to be destroyed by oil companies, their land to be destroyed. But the profits are so massive, and there's so much corruption within the Venezuelan government that politicians are getting very, very wealthy off of either taking bribes from oil companies or just embezzling some of the money from the contract in the first place. Later laws in the kind of going on to the Gomez's era, even by the 1920s, will only give oil companies the right to explore and extract, but not to sell or refine the oil. So there's some changes to reduce the amount of destruction going on, and for the government to have a bigger role in this oil-based economy. But Gomez also allowed these oil companies influence over drafting a lot of those laws. So the oil companies obviously want the right to do whatever they want and to maximize their profits. So the oil companies advocate for contracts for longer time periods over larger amounts of land. And the big law passed in 1922, the big kind of reform that wasn't much of a reform. It gave oil companies even more power in Venezuela. So that passed in 1922 and largely stayed in effect into the 1940s. And that will become a kind of hated law amongst many Venezuelan people because they realize that it is allowing foreign companies to come in and basically take whatever they want from the country, and that their political leaders are involved in this kind of scam. And oil will dominate Venezuela's economy from the 1920s really forward. Oil becomes Venezuela's biggest export in 1926. And Venezuela will become the second largest oil producing country by 1929, only behind the United States. And again, this is before the massive, even larger oil reserves are discovered in the Middle East. And this oil exploitation really pushes forward Venezuela's industrialization. The profits are so large for oil companies that they want to build more and more, bigger refineries and all these types of things. And that brings a lot of workers into industrial settings. So even foreign oil companies will employ Venezuelan people to do the manual labor and to work in the oil refining factories and all these things. And they pay fairly good wages to those workers. So it's a decent job to have if you're thinking about how much money you make per year. So a lot of Venezuelans leave the coffee farms and they go into the oil fields because the pay is higher. But a lot of those oil companies, much like in Bolivia with the mining companies, they build basically company towns where they build the housing and they'll charge the employees kind of monthly rent. The companies will also build most of the economy around those towns. Like they will own the grocery stores, the clothing stores, all these other kinds of places where the workers go to spend their money, to spend their wages. And the oil companies figured out that one way to reduce the economic cost of those high wages is just to charge very high prices for groceries and all these other types of things. And these are often in areas that are fairly isolated away from any other towns. So any workers that live in those areas, they don't have a whole lot of options for where to go to buy things. So the company has really monopolized the whole economy of the area where they're extracting oil from. And they charge such high prices that they basically take those wages back from the workers. So the workers can say that they're making good money, but they have high living costs. They're spending a lot of their money, and that money goes right back into the pockets of the oil company in the first place. So oil is an extremely profitable business for companies in Venezuela if they can, get into that market. So these oil-based investments basically completely dominate the Venezuelan economy in the 1920s and going forward into at least the 1940s. And many historians argue even much, much further into Venezuelan history, even going right up to today. And one thing, though, that the oil economy did was to destroy the landowners' power in the Venezuelan government. So the Caudillo era ends very quickly and in a crashing out type of fashion because these oil companies are so much more profitable and therefore powerful in Venezuela that the landowners can't make nearly enough money off of selling coffee beans or whatever. Venezuelan agriculture just as a sector declines steeply in this era. And eventually there's so many Venezuelans working in the oil economy that Venezuela can't even grow enough food in its own farmlands to feed its population. So it has to start importing food by the 1940s to feed its people. And the Venezuelan government was fairly weak. It was a dictatorship where all power really flowed from the president's decisions. And therefore the president didn't really have a whole lot of big interest in building up a civil bureaucracy to advise him and make big decisions and implement big decisions. Gomez was not interested in building a central bank to basically be a treasury that collects taxes and oversees spending. And a lot of his advisors didn't really want that either because they're all embezzling from the government in the first place to make themselves rich. Gomez was also not interested in building an independent court system, an independent judiciary, because the more power that you give to a court system to enforce laws really takes away power from the president's position. So Gomez was mostly interested in keeping as much political and social power in the presidency as he possibly could, and that's really how he ran the government. The president, after that 1922 law, was the final decision maker over any contracts that the government would sign with foreign oil companies to give them those concessions over developing the oil economy. So because he was the last decision maker, he usually took the biggest bribes from oil companies that wanted to get those contracts. So again, Gomez was extremely violent and corrupt and repressive. He generally solved any political debate or criticism by humiliating his critics or just throwing them in jail or torturing them or kicking them out of the country, or even just killing them, just having them killed. The biggest protest against the Gomez dictatorship started to happen in the universities amongst younger students, especially in the Central University in 1928, where students started to gather in public and speak out against the dictatorship and demand more democracy. And the government's response was extremely brutal, sent in the army and killed many of them, jailed the rest, and exiled a whole bunch of them, so kicked them out of the country. But in 1928, these protests are a big kind of watershed event. The protests fail, the government stays in office. But it's kind of like a trial by fire for a lot of younger people that are thinking about politics. So a lot of them become somewhat famous in Venezuela, and in the future, when they are allowed to return to Venezuela, those who survived, and when they're released from jail or allowed to return from exile several years later, they will use their fame as being some of the student protest leaders to start building up new political parties and try to bring down the dictatorship. Gomez fell from power in 1935. He was getting old anyway, but the military continued to run the government even after that. And the military basically runs the country on a law and order type of system. That's their general statement. They just want stability. And they want to continue. The economy is growing fairly well because of the oil economy, and they want to continue that growth and continue to enhance Venezuela's position in the international oil market. But one of the student leaders from 1928 who was allowed to return to the country in the early 1940s is named Romulo Betancourt. And he and others returned to form a new political party that they call the Acción Democrática Party in 1941. So the Democratic Action Party. So they're going to advocate for more democracy. And in response, the military government formed its own political party eventually in order to, if they ever have to run elections or anything like that, but also to put their message out to the public about what they're about and how good they're doing, all those things. And in the early 1940s, you get some constitutional changes in Venezuela that give voters the power to elect their legislature, the national legislature, the Congress. But Congress would then meet and vote on who the president should be. So that's what we call indirect election of the president. Basically, the people elect the legislature, and then the legislature chooses one of their own to run the administration, run the executive branch. The constitutional change in the early 40s also allowed the Communist Party to exist, so communists will start to organize also at the same time. And by 1945, the military government is, there's a lot of internal division to the point where some younger officers overthrow the government in October 1945 and put this guy Betancourt into office as president. So he is not put into office by a democratic election, even though he supports democracy and he wants to see it happen. He gets his opportunity through a military coup, where the leaders of the coup thought by putting him in office it might be a kind of a way where the military could keep some amount of power while giving in to some demands for democracy. So it's kind of a hedging their bets type of move. So Betancourt, once he's in office, he sent all the former dictatorship leaders into exile, so he kicked them all out of the country. And he kicked up the tax on oil company profits to 50%. So that immediately causes a huge growth in government revenue on a yearly basis. And he will allow presidential election, national elections in 1947. So other political parties start to organize from 45, 46, and going into 47, preparing for those elections to occur. And the eventual winner of those elections is named Romulo Gallegos. So he won the 1947 elections, and he will be installed as president. He largely ran on the idea of kind of democracy can fix all of Venezuela's problems and alleviate poverty to a great extent, and especially use these taxes on the rich, especially the oil companies, to fund industrial development, building roads and hospitals and schools. And he says we can do all of this stuff. And his party largely took a lot of power in Congress, so he has a lot of ability to force a lot of this program through. And a lot of the military leaders kind of held private meetings with him after he won the election and said, you shouldn't really try to do this stuff because we're opposed to it, and we think it's kind of opening the floodgates to kind of popular government that would destabilize the whole society. But he refused to compromise, and he started going forward with his platform, trying to put it into effect. And so in 1948, November, less than a year in office, the military overthrew him. He refused to give military leaders positions in his administration or in the new government. And the military started getting pretty paranoid. There were rumors that Gallegos was very supportive of the Gaitan movement in Colombia, the heavily populist anti-oligarch movement. And so the military overthrew Gallegos in November 1948. They kicked him out of power, and basically the military kept power for itself. So the military will run the government for the next few years, and it will dissolve unions, especially the oil worker unions. It will close universities when students complain about what has happened. It will outlaw the Communist Party again. And they eventually announced that they'll hold new national elections in 1952. And when those elections resulted in the election of democratic leaders that promised to get rid of the dictatorship and go back to what Gallegos had wanted to do, then the military annulled the results, basically said that they were illegitimate, and the military retains control over the country. So they keep their dictatorship going. And by this point, 1952, the general population is outraged that this has happened. They hate this military dictatorship. So the only way that the dictators can stay in control is just through mass repression of the population. So the government does everything it can to jail its opponents, kick them out of the country, do whatever is necessary to make sure that no political movement can rise up against them. The military leaders do, though, continue investing in massive public works projects like roads and hospitals and whatnot. And because they've taken such a hard stance against allowing any communist party to exist, the United States likes that a lot. So the military leaders form a close alliance with the United States for the Cold War. So the military leaders try to completely destroy the Acción Democrática Party, which they largely do through jailing its leaders and its founders and whatnot. And the United States was so happy with that repression that President Eisenhower, U.S. President Eisenhower, awarded the U.S. Legion of Merit to the military leader of the Venezuelan dictatorship. So the United States is very on board with all this stuff, and in a very obvious and public way, so it's not even secret. So in 1958, there is another election that the government has announced, and the military dictators try to basically rig the election in their favor by all kinds of different means, repressing the vote, stuffing ballot boxes with fraudulent votes for their own candidates. And this is largely led by the president of the country at the time, who was basically the dictator. And this was so kind of egregious. It was so extreme and so obvious that this had happened in 1928 in these elections that the other military leaders basically thought that this went way too far. And they kicked him out of the, not just out of office, but out of the whole country. So this is a political crisis. The military has basically admitted that its own leader had run a fraudulent election to the point that he shouldn't even be allowed to live in the country anymore. And most of the population is on the side of democracy, and that seems fairly obvious. So what happens in 1958 is there is a deal amongst the three major kind of democratic parties that are opposed to the military government, the oil companies that still want to see their profits go forward, and some of the military leaders that had kicked the former president out of office in 1958 in the first place. So even after the military coup happened in 1958, they met secretly and formed basically a political treaty amongst their kind of three different interests that becomes known as the Pact of Punto Fijo. And it is really an agreement where the main democratic parties, three of them, agree that they will hold elections every few years, and whichever party wins the election, they will go into office. But even the party that is in power will not completely dominate the tax revenue from oil companies. That the leading party will evenly divide the oil revenues amongst the other two parties that did not win the election. So the three major parties will basically evenly divide the tax revenues and even often divide government appointments into the administration. So even if one party wins an election, it's not like they're going to completely rule the country all by themselves. They're going to rule it in cooperation with the two parties who had lost the election. And oil companies get a decrease in their tax rates, and the military gets the promise of very large military budgets going into the future. So this Pact of Punto Fijo will run Venezuelan politics into the 1990s. So it lasts quite a long time. It is an agreement that's built on some attempt to get stability and to continue industrializing the country. And it achieves those goals, and industrialization continues at a pretty good rapid pace. Venezuela becomes known as one of the most stable of all Latin American governments from the 1950s forward. And Venezuela becomes also one of the more prosperous countries going forward. So it is one of the kind of examples of good governance for the next several decades, right through the end of the Cold War. So we'll talk more about the Pact of Punto Fijo and Venezuela in relation to the Cold War as we go forward. And then as we get into the 1990s, when the politicians become so corrupted by this easy expectation of this deal continuing, that they start making such giant mistakes that will put them in a bad position. But we'll stop here for today in 1958 in Venezuela as this pact gets going. Later on we'll move on to kind of Cold War diplomacy and how the Cold War will impact a lot of these remaining dictatorships and these political parties going forward.